The courtroom is meant to be a sanctuary of truth, a place where facts are weighed, evidence is examined, and justice prevails. But sometimes, the reality is far from the ideal. In certain cases, the verdict is not dictated by truth, but by power, bias, and corruption. That was exactly what unfolded in the case of Nathan Hale. As I sat in the jury box, the air felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. The room itself carried a presence, a quiet authority that was meant to enforce order. But today, it felt more like a stage, a performance. Every role had already been assigned, and every line was carefully rehearsed. The judge, the prosecution, the jury, we were all just pieces in a puzzle that had been put together long before the trial had even begun. Nathan Hale sat in his wheelchair, motionless, his hands resting in his lap. He was the accused, a black man in his 40s, charged with fraud, accused of forging documents to steal government aid. The prosecution's case against him was airtight, too airtight. The evidence was pristine, no errors, no inconsistencies, nothing that would suggest doubt. It all fit together too well, as if someone had crafted it with the precision of an architect designing a building. But real cases don't look like that. I glanced at the other jurors. Some nodded along with the prosecutor's argument, their faces blank, resigned to the inevitability of the case. Others fidgeted, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. But no one spoke. No one questioned the evidence. No one wanted to disrupt the flow of what was happening. It was easier to go along with what was expected than to push back against the force pressing down on us all. And then there was Judge Richard Vaughn, a man who commanded the room with just his presence. Tall, sharp-eyed, with a voice that carried authority. He didn't just preside over the case, he controlled it. There was something chilling about how detached he was, as if this wasn't a trial to him, but a process to be managed. Every ruling he made, every word he spoke, subtly reinforced the idea that Nathan's fate was already sealed. The trial was just a formality. Nathan barely spoke. When the prosecutor, David Sinclair, questioned him, his response was calm, deliberate. "I admit that someone wanted it to look that way," he said. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. It was a strange answer, unexpected. It was not the frantic denial of a guilty man, nor was it the desperate plea of someone who had been caught. It was something else entirely. Judge Vaughn's smirk deepened. He leaned forward slightly, tapping his fingers against the polished wood of his bench. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "You're telling this court that these official records documents bearing your name, your signature, your fingerprints are fabricated?" Nathan met his gaze without hesitation. "That's exactly what I'm saying." The air in the room shifted. I felt it. The kind of stillness that comes just before a storm. I glanced down at the stack of documents neatly arranged on the prosecution's table. Too clean, too perfect. It was then that a thought entered my mind, a thought I hadn't dared to entertain before. What if Nathan was telling the truth? And worse, what if we were all being played? But in Judge Vaughn's courtroom, the truth didn't matter. The illusion of justice was all that mattered. The verdict had already been decided, and we were just there to play our parts. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I was here to deliver justice or just to witness an execution. Nathan Hale sat in his wheelchair, unmoving, his face unreadable. His hands rested calmly on his lap, his posture unnaturally still. The weight of the accusations against him filled the courtroom like an unspoken force, pressing down on everyone inside. But despite the gravity of his situation, Nathan did not look afraid. He did not look desperate. He simply watched, as if waiting for something no one else could see coming. The prosecution had painted him as a fraudster, a criminal who had manipulated the system for his own gain. According to the charges, he had forged official documents to receive government aid he was not entitled to, stealing money from hardworking taxpayers. They called it an open and shut case, a crime with clear evidence, undeniable proof. From the moment the prosecutor, David Sinclair, stood before the jury, his confidence was palpable. He presented the evidence flawlessly. Financial records, signed forms, transaction histories, all traced back to Nathan Hale. Every document was crisp, clean, without a single inconsistency. It was too perfect. That was what unsettled me. Real cases aren't this neat. Investigations leave gaps, contradictions, errors, human mistakes. But in this case, there were none. Everything lined up exactly as the prosecution wanted it to. And yet, Nathan didn't react the way guilty men do. He didn't beg. He didn't argue. He didn't panic. He simply listened. Sinclair stepped forward, his voice smooth and persuasive. "Mr. Hale, do you deny that these documents bear your signature?" Nathan's gaze remained steady. He exhaled slowly before answering. "I don't deny that my name is on them." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. I felt my own pulse quicken. Why would he admit that? Sinclair smirked, sensing his victory. "Then you admit to the fraud?" Nathan tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged. "I admit that someone wanted it to look that way." The air in the room shifted. It was barely perceptible, but I felt it. Something had changed. Judge Vaughn, who had been watching from the bench with quiet amusement, leaned forward. His fingers tapped against the wood, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Fabricated," he repeated, drawing out the word. "Yes." Nathan's voice was unwavering. "That's exactly what I'm saying." I heard a chair creak behind me. A few jurors exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. No one wanted to say out loud what we were all starting to feel, that this wasn't as simple as we had been led to believe. I looked down at the neatly stacked files on the prosecution's table. Each piece of evidence, every form, every transaction, it all fit together too well. It was as if the case had been built, not just against Nathan, but around him. Judge Vaughn's expression remained unreadable, but his smirk was gone. The way he studied Nathan now was different, as if he wasn't just looking at a defendant anymore. For the first time since this trial began, a new thought crossed my mind. What if Nathan Hale wasn't the criminal in this room? What if he was the victim? The weight of that possibility settled heavily in my chest. Because if it was true, then this trial wasn't about justice at all. It was about something much worse. From the moment Judge Richard Vaughn entered the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. He was a man who didn't just preside over the law, he controlled it. His presence alone commanded obedience, his sharp gaze sweeping over the room like a king surveying his domain. There was something cold about him, something that made people unconsciously straighten in their seats when he spoke. He didn't need to raise his voice. His authority was absolute. Every movement, every word carried an unshakable certainty, as if he already knew the outcome of this case before it even began. And perhaps he did. Vaughn was the kind of judge who decided the verdict long before the jury had a chance to deliberate. He wasn't interested in fairness, only efficiency, control, and maintaining his power. From the moment Nathan Hale rolled into the courtroom, Vaughn barely regarded him as a man, only as a case number, a problem to be swiftly dealt with. His amusement at Nathan's situation was obvious, the slight smirk that tugged at the corner of his mouth whenever the defense tried to push back. Nathan's attorney, James Holloway, had barely begun raising doubts about the flawless evidence when Vaughn's gavel slammed down, cutting him off. "That's enough," Vaughn said, his voice firm, unwavering. "This court will not entertain baseless accusations." Holloway hesitated, gripping the edges of his papers. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we can't ignore the possibility." Bang! The judge's gavel struck the bench again, harder this time. "I said enough." His eyes locked onto Holloway with a silent warning, daring him to push further. At that moment, it became clear this wasn't a trial. This was a performance, and Vaughn was both the director and the final authority. Nathan sat still, watching. He didn't protest, didn't argue. He seemed to understand what was happening better than anyone else in the room. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't about evidence. This wasn't about justice. This was about power. Vaughn leaned back in his chair, exhaling as if the entire exchange had been an inconvenience rather than a legal proceeding. His ruling wasn't about following the law, it was about maintaining control. I glanced at the other jurors. Some kept their eyes locked on the neatly stacked files in front of them, pretending not to see what was happening. Others shifted in their seats, their unease evident. But no one spoke, because we all knew the unspoken rule of this courtroom. Vaughn's word was final. Questioning him meant making yourself a target. He had built his career on this kind of control. How many other cases had he decided before they even began? How many innocent people had he silenced with a gavel, a glare, and the weight of his authority? The thought made my pulse quicken. Nathan Hale was on trial. But in that moment, I realized the real criminal might be sitting on the judge's bench. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. The tension was thick, pressing down on all of us, an invisible weight that no one dared to acknowledge. Judge Vaughn sat high on his bench, his face impassive, but his eyes gleamed with something close to amusement. He had made up his mind long before this moment. That much was clear. With an air of finality, he leaned forward. "Nathan Hale, I find you guilty." The words landed like a hammer. A hush fell over the room. No gasps, no murmurs, just silence, thick and suffocating. Even though we all expected this, it still felt like a gut punch, like watching a man walk toward an execution instead of a fair trial. Nathan, however, didn't react. No outburst, no plea, no look of shock or anger. He simply sat there, staring ahead, as if the words meant nothing to him. That's when it happened. A sound so small at first that I almost missed it, the slow creak of a wheelchair shifting against the floor. I turned toward it, barely breathing. Nathan placed his hands on the armrests and pushed himself up, not struggling, not wobbling. He stood. For a moment, the entire room froze. Someone in the gallery gasped aloud. A juror's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the floor. Even the prosecutor, David Sinclair, the man who had delivered the case with such confidence, blinked, his mouth slightly open, as if his brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. But the most shocking reaction came from Judge Vaughn. The man who had been so sure of his authority, so confident in his control over this trial, suddenly jerked backward in his seat. His hands, once lazily draped over the bench, now gripped the wood as if bracing for impact. For the first time since this trial began, I saw something in his eyes that I never expected: fear. Nathan reached into his pocket. For a split second, no one moved. The shock of seeing him on his feet had stolen every ounce of logic from the room. But as his hand emerged, gripping something small and metallic, Vaughn's fingers twitched toward his gavel, as if he still believed he could silence this moment. He couldn't. Nathan flipped open the badge. Nathan Hale, Special Agent, United States Department of Justice. The silence shattered. A woman in the jury box sucked in a sharp breath, her face pale. The man beside her shifted, his jaw clenched tight. The courtroom, which had just moments ago felt so rigid, so controlled, was unraveling before our eyes. The prosecutor took a single step back, his confidence crumbling. Judge Vaughn did not move. For a long, unbearable second, he just stared. Nathan took a step forward, his voice steady. "I've been investigating you for months, Vaughn." Vaughn's jaw clenched, his knuckles turned white against the bench. "How many innocent people have you condemned?" Nathan's voice was calm, but there was a quiet fury beneath it. "How many times have you sold verdicts to the highest bidder?" Vaughn said nothing. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by a blank expression. He looked at Nathan, then at the jury, then at the prosecution, but there was no way out. The truth had been revealed, and this time, he was the one on trial. For a long moment, the courtroom was completely silent. The weight of Nathan Hale's revelation hung heavy in the air, pressing against every person in the room like an invisible force. Judge Vaughn, once the most powerful figure in this courtroom, a man who had commanded respect through fear, did not move. He sat frozen, his fingers gripping the edge of his bench, his jaw tight. It was as if, for the first time in his life, he had lost control. Nathan Hale took another step forward, his badge still glinting under the harsh courtroom lights. "You thought you could keep getting away with it, Vaughn," he said, his voice calm, deliberate. "But your time is up." A ripple of unease passed through the room. The jurors shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged nervous glances, as if only now realizing the magnitude of what was happening. The gallery spectators, who had come expecting to see a simple sentencing, now watched with wide, disbelieving eyes. This wasn't just another trial. This was something much bigger. And at the center of it all was Judge Vaughn, his carefully maintained world crumbling around him. Then, bang! The courtroom doors burst open with a force that sent an audible shockwave through the room. A dozen federal agents stormed in, their movements swift and calculated. Panic spread like wildfire. One of the jurors gasped. A woman in the gallery let out a strangled cry. Prosecutor David Sinclair, the once smooth and confident lawyer, staggered backward, his face drained of color, But Vaughn fought. With a desperate lurch, he shot to his feet, his eyes darting wildly. "No," he breathed, his voice raw with disbelief. "This is my courtroom." His hands slammed against the bench. "I am the law here." But the illusion was gone. Vaughn's words, once commands that could decide a man's fate, now sounded desperate, hollow. 2 agents were on him in seconds. Vaughn thrashed, but it was no use. His arms were yanked behind his back. Click. The sound of the handcuffs was final. Vaughn let out a sharp, furious breath, his body stiffening as the cold steel locked around his wrists. His head snapped toward Nathan, eyes burning with rage. "You can't do this to me," he snarled. "I'm a judge." Nathan didn't flinch. Not anymore. For the first time, Vaughn was powerless. The agents turned him around, leading him away from the bench he had ruled from for so many years. His face, once so composed, so smug, was twisted with fury, with disbelief. As he was dragged through the courtroom, Vaughn's gaze swept across the room, searching for something: sympathy, outrage, someone to protest what was happening. But there was nothing. Not one voice rose to defend him. The jurors who had once feared him sat in silence. The spectators who had once watched him pass judgment looked on with wide eyes, unsure whether to feel relief or shock. Even the prosecution, the very people who had built this case against Nathan Hale, said nothing, because they all knew the truth now. Vaughn was never a judge. He was a fraud, and true justice had finally caught up to him. As Judge Vaughn was led away in handcuffs, the weight that had been suffocating the courtroom finally lifted. For the first time since I had stepped into this room, I felt like I could breathe again. But the silence that followed wasn't one of triumph, it was one of reckoning. We had just witnessed the fall of a man who had ruled this courtroom with unchecked power, a man who had manipulated the very system he had sworn to uphold. And yet, as the agents disappeared through the doors, dragging Vaughn away, one question remained in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. How many others had suffered before Nathan Hale stood up? I looked around the room, my eyes scanning the faces of my fellow jurors. Some of them still sat stiffly in their seats, their expressions blank, as if their minds were struggling to catch up with reality. Others had their heads bowed, perhaps in shame, perhaps in relief. Because the truth was, we had all felt it. The unease, the sense that something wasn't right, that the case had been decided before we had even been sworn in. But none of us had spoken up, and that realization sat heavy in my chest. Nathan Hale had won today. Justice for once had prevailed. But the fact that it had taken an undercover federal agent, an elaborate operation, and a dramatic unmasking to bring down a corrupt judge made me wonder, how many innocent people had Vaughn condemned before this? How many men and women, lacking Nathan's resources and connections, had walked into this courtroom believing they would get a fair trial, only to leave in shackles? How many families had been torn apart? How many lives had been ruined? I clenched my hands into fists, my knuckles turning white. For years I had believed in the justice system. I had trusted that the courts operated fairly, that the law was blind to race, status, or power. I had thought that truth always found a way to rise to the surface. But today, I had seen the truth for what it really was: fragile. The law was only as just as the people who upheld it. And when men like Vaughn sat in power, justice was not justice, it was a performance. A game rigged against those who didn't have the means to fight back. As I turned my attention back to Nathan Hale, I expected to see relief in his expression. Victory. Instead, his face was calm, not triumphant, not satisfied, just resolute, because he knew this wasn't the end. Vaughn had fallen, but how many others like him still sat behind the bench, passing down sentences, making decisions that would alter lives forever? I exhaled slowly. This trial was never about just one man. It was about a system that allowed men like Vaughn to exist. And if we all simply walked away from this moment without learning anything, without changing anything, then what had really been won? I took one last look at the now empty judge's bench. The seat of power that had once belonged to Vaughn no longer felt intimidating, because today it was nothing more than an empty chair. And that meant there was hope, because justice doesn't happen by itself. It takes people willing to fight for it, even when it's dangerous, even when it's easier to look away, even when the whole world is telling you to stay quiet. Nathan Hale had stood up today literally and figuratively. The question now was, who would be next? Justice is not automatic. It doesn't happen simply because we believe in fairness or because the law is written on paper. Justice exists only when people are willing to fight for it. The downfall of Judge Vaughn is a stark reminder that corruption thrives in silence. It wasn't just his abuse of power that was troubling. It was the fact that so many people saw it but did nothing. How often do we turn a blind eye to injustice because it's easier to stay quiet? Nathan Hale didn't win because the system worked. He won because he challenged it. He stood up when no one else would. And that is the lesson we must carry forward. In our everyday lives, whether in the workplace, in our communities, or even online, we all have moments where we can choose to speak up or stay silent. What we do in those moments defines us. Corruption, discrimination, and injustice only continue when good people choose to do nothing. The question isn't whether injustice exists. The question is, will you stand up against it? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.